A deafening roar tears through the night air, drowning out the screams of the dying. It is the sound of ancient cedar wood snapping in an inferno so intense that molten gold drips down the white marble steps of the temple like tears of fire. In the scorching summer of 70 CE, what began as a routine suppression of a provincial revolt spiraled into one of the most clinically brutal events in human history. The Roman war machine did not just seek victory, it sought total erasure. By the time the smoke cleared, over 1 million people lay dead, not just by the Roman gladius, but by a famine so horrific that mothers were driven to the unthinkable. Welcome back to World Chronicles. Today, we witness the Siege of Jerusalem, the tactical masterclass that cemented the power of the Flavian dynasty, and the tragedy that paid for the Colosseum in blood. In the spring of 70 CE, the hills of Judea did not echo with the songs of birds, but with the rhythmic, terrifying thunder of iron hobnails striking dry earth as the full weight of the Roman Empire descended upon Jerusalem. 4 years earlier, the rebels had done the impossible by humiliating Cestius Gallus and seizing the eagle of the 12th Legion, a stain on Roman honor that could only be washed away with total annihilation. Now, the 12th had returned, marching alongside the 5th Macedonica, the 15th Apollinaris, and the dreaded 10th Fretensis, forming a grand host of nearly 70,000 men that stretched across the horizon like a river of steel. At their head rode Titus, the son of the new Emperor Vespasian, as this young commander desperate to prove that he was not merely a prince, but a conqueror capable of eclipsing his father's legacy. As the legions crested Mount Scopus and looked down upon the Golden City, the air grew heavy with the scent of dust and the metallic tang of sharpened iron, while the deafening silence of the discipline contrasted sharply with the chaotic jeers erupting from the city walls. Titus knew that behind those massive fortifications lay a population swollen by Passover pilgrims, a city that should have been impregnable to anything but starvation. However, as the Roman engineers began to unload their massive scorpions and ballistae, the young general realized that his greatest ally was not his artillery, but a madness that had already taken root inside the enemy stronghold. While the Roman legions tightened their iron grip around the Mount of Olives, a far more terrifying war was already consuming Jerusalem from within. Inside the walls, the city was not a united front of resistance, but a slaughterhouse of rival factions. Simon Bar Giora held the upper city with 10,000 men, John of Gischala controlled the Temple Mount with 6,000, and Eleazar ben Simon barricaded himself in the inner courts of the sanctuary. Instead of preparing defenses, these zealot leaders spent the precious weeks before Titus arrived ambushing each other in the streets, turning the holy pavement slick with the blood of their own people. Then, in a moment of suicidal madness that would seal the fate of every man, woman, and child in the city, the factions set fire to the massive grain silos near the temple. The intent was twisted logic. By destroying the food reserves that could have sustained the city for years, they hoped to force the population to fight or die. As the smoke of burning wheat, the scent of their own future starvation, drifted over the walls to the Roman camp, Titus must have watched in disbelief. The defenders had done his work for him. By burning their own grain, they had started a clock that could not be stopped. The Romans didn't need to kill them all, they just had to wait. But Titus was young, hungry for glory, and he had no patience for a slow siege of attrition. Titus unleashed the full fury of Roman engineering, transforming the siege from a battle of wills into a mathematical certainty of destruction. The legions constructed massive earthworks and rolled forward 3 colossal siege towers, towering over the walls like wooden giants clad in iron plates to resist fire. Behind them, the artillery began its grim work. 160 engines per legion, including heavy ballistae capable of hurling 25-kilogram white limestone rocks over 400 meters. The impact was so terrifying that when the watchmen on the walls saw the white stones flying against the blue sky, they would scream a warning. "The sun is coming," giving the defenders seconds to scatter before the masonry exploded. To counter this, the Romans blackened the stones with soot, turning them invisible against the horizon until the moment they shattered bone and stone alike with a sickening thud that shook the earth like a localized earthquake. Under this relentless bombardment, the battering rams, massive beams of oak capped with iron heads, began to pound the third wall. While on the 15th day of the siege, the wall groaned and collapsed, followed rapidly by the second wall just 5 days later. The Romans poured into the new city, but the victory was a trap. The narrow, winding streets turned into suffocating kill zones where the heavy legionary formations lost their advantage against light-footed zealots raining death from the rooftops. The outer shell of Jerusalem was broken, but ahead lay the Antonia fortress and the temple itself, fortifications so strong they were considered impregnable by human hands. To take them, Titus would have to abandon his machines and unleash a nightmare. Frustrated by the stalemate and the fanaticism of the defenders, Titus ordered the legions to sheath their swords and pick up their spades. In a feat of engineering that defies belief, the Roman army constructed an 8-kilometer wall of earth and timber around the entire circumference of the city in just 3 days, sealing Jerusalem as tight as a tomb. With the supply lines severed, the cage of bone was locked, and famine began to devour the population from the inside out. Josephus records that the valleys below the walls filled so high with corpses thrown from the ramparts that the Romans could smell the rot from their camps miles away. Those desperate enough to slip out at night to forage for roots were captured and crucified in full view of the walls. At the height of the horror, 500 wretched souls were nailed to wood every single day until there was no more wood for crosses and no more room for bodies. Inside, and the desperation reached a peak that still chills historians today. A noblewoman named Mary of Bethazuba, maddened by hunger, roasted and ate her own infant son, an act so unnatural that it silenced even the hardened zealots. With the city starving, the defenders fought with the fury of the doomed, their bodies wasting away, but their resolve hardening like iron. However, the Romans had found a weak point in the towering Antonia fortress, and they waited for the darkest part of the night. Under the cover of a moonless night, the fate of Jerusalem was decided not by siege engines, but by the silent climb of a small band of auxiliaries scaling the rubble of the Antonia fortress. This massive structure, perched on a precipice of rock, was the tactical key to the entire city, looming directly over the temple courts like a predator waiting to strike. While the starving guards slept, the Roman commandos slit their throats and sounded their trumpets, shattering the silence and signaling Titus to pour the legions into the breach. The battle that followed was a claustrophobic nightmare fought in narrow tunnels and atop the fortress walls, where formation discipline dissolved into a brutal melee of gladius against dagger. In a display of supreme virtues, a centurion named Julianus charged the Jewish line alone, driving them back with the sheer weight of his violence until his hobnailed boots slipped on the slick mosaic pavement, a fatal error of terrain that cost him his life as the zealots swarmed him like angry wasps. Yet his sacrifice bought time. By dawn, the Romans held the fortress. For the first time, as Titus looked down from the high ground into the sacred courtyards of the temple, the heart of the rebellion now lying naked and exposed beneath the Roman gaze. The fortress was taken, but the order was given. The final sanctuary would not be taken by the sword alone. It would be purified by fire. On the 9th of Av, a date already scarred by tragedy in Jewish history, the Roman war machine finally breached the inner sanctuary. Whether by the deliberate command of Titus to erase the spiritual heart of the rebellion, or, as Josephus claims, A soldier swept up in the fury of battle, hurling a torch into the curtains of the holy place. The result was the same: apocalypse. The cedar beams, dry as bone after the long summer, caught fire instantly, turning the Temple Mount into a furnace so hot that it pushed the fighting back. Amidst the roar of the flames, a sound rose that was even more terrifying: the collective wail of the city as they watched their god's house burn. The heat was so intense that the massive gold plating of the temple walls began to melt, running down the steps like a river of glowing lava, driving the Roman soldiers into a frenzy of looting as they tore apart the smoking stones to pry out the precious metal. This chaotic greed fulfilled a prophecy spoken decades earlier. Literally, not one stone was left upon another. The temple was gone, reduced to ash and memory. But amidst the smoke and slaughter, the leaders of the rebellion, Simon and John, had vanished. The slaughter wasn't finished. It was about to move underground. The fire on the Temple Mount was not the end. It was merely the signal for the final grim hunt. With the spiritual heart of the rebellion turned to ash, the remaining zealots retreated to the upper city, barricading themselves within the thick walls of Herod's palace. But their spirit was broken. When the legions breached these final defenses, they found little resistance, only the hollow stares of starving men and the silence of a city waiting to die. The real war had moved underground, into the labyrinth of sewers and caverns beneath the streets. Here, amidst the filth and darkness, the Roman soldiers hunted the rebel leaders like animals in a burrow. John of Gischala, driven by hunger, surrendered to the mercy of the conquerors and was sentenced to life imprisonment. Simon Bar Giora, however, chose a theatrical end. Weeks later, he suddenly rose from the earth on the ruined Temple Mount, clad in white tunics and a purple mantle, appearing like a ghost to the startled guards. But the Romans were not superstitious men. They simply shackled him. The fighting was over, replaced by the cold administrative brutality of the victor's justice. A Roman officer named Fronto sat in judgment, sorting the survivors with a wave of his hand. The tall and handsome were reserved for the triumph in Rome. The rest were condemned to the deadly copper mines of Egypt or the gladiatorial arenas of the provinces. Jerusalem was plowed like a field, its walls leveled to the bedrock. But the immense gold taken from its ashes would travel to Rome, where it would build a monument that still stands today. A theater of death paid for by the death of a nation. The triumph held in Rome was a spectacle of gold and misery that eclipsed the sun. Titus and Vespasian rode in chariots of ivory, parading the sacred treasures of the temple, the golden table of showbread, the silver trumpets, and the massive 7-branched menorah through the streets of the capital. But these were not just trophies. They were the currency of a new era. Recent archaeological evidence confirms that the construction of the Colosseum, the greatest amphitheater the world has ever seen, was funded ex manubiis, from the spoils of the Jewish war. The irony is staggering. The most iconic symbol of Roman entertainment stands on a foundation of Judean genocide. For the Jewish people, the fall of Jerusalem was not an end, but a transformation. With the temple destroyed, the faith shifted from animal sacrifice to the study of Torah, giving birth to Rabbinic Judaism, a portable fortress that would sustain them through 2,000 years of exile. The war would flicker once more at the fortress of Masada, where 960 rebels chose suicide over slavery, but the flame of the revolt was extinguished. The legions had done their work. Rome had proven that it could not only defeat a god, but dismantle his house stone by stone. Yet, while the empire eventually crumbled into dust, the story of Jerusalem remains, a testament to the terrifying cost of defying the eagle. Please subscribe to our channel to relive heroic chapters of history with us.